There are three elements to an offending behaviour: access, opportunity, and motivation. So he created some of his programs undoubtedly in order to gain access and the opportunity to offend against children. A very dangerous man with a huge profile. My name's Mark Williams-Thomas. I'm an investigative reporter and private detective, and it was my work that finally exposed Jimmy Savile. Most of my work now is between doing investigations for people. So I do a lot of private investigations, perhaps tracking people down, investigating people's wrongdoing. And then the other work, of course, is I front up television programs, but there's always a purpose. There's always a purpose, and that is to get answers for people.
What kind of answers?
Well, justice comes in many forms. So some people might say justice is taking someone to court. For others, justice is just getting answers in relation to what happened to their loved ones. So the sad reality is there's hundreds, thousands of families out there who just don't know what's happened to their loved one, whether it be the fact they've been killed and they haven't caught the offender. They might not even know where their loved one is. And that might not be necessarily a murder, it might just be a missing person. And these people are left with questions, answers, and closure in many ways. So what I always do whenever I work on any investigation, my starting point is, first of all, can I help them? There's no point getting involved if the reality is I can't actually help them and take their case any further forward. So that's the starting point. And then the second element, which is the most important element, is can I give them answers? Can I get new information from them? Sometimes that new information might be quite small, or sometimes it might be really significant. But I always make that promise to them. And when I first started out in this line of work, I wouldn't say that promise to people because I thought, can I honestly do that? But now I've done it so many times and I've taken on so many cases, I can say with absolute certainty that every single case I've taken on, I have found new information out and I have helped families. So that is really important, and that's kind of the backbone of why I do it. I'd got to a point kind of in the police service where I'd done everything I wanted to do. I didn't go into firearms. I didn't want to do firearms because I didn't want that responsibility of taking someone else's life. I wasn't interested in drugs. Drugs really wasn't an area of interest to me, and neither really at that stage was traffic. So it was crime. I was fascinated in crime. I was fascinated in solving crime. And that took me down the route of being a detective.
So before we talk about Jimmy Savile, what was the highest profile case you'd worked on up to that point?
Well, I was involved in the Jonathan King investigation to a degree. I then left the police service. But that started just before I left. I was involved with a shooting of an individual who was considered at the time to be a American diplomat. So I was involved in that. And I think probably, loads and loads of investigations. I can't think in terms of numbers, but a lot of high profile cases there and a lot of investigations that were very complex and very difficult. So Jimmy Savile, over his lifetime, he was a man who basically set up in and around kind of the north of England. He'd created these discos, which was essentially a couple of pounds, and children would pay a couple of pounds. They'd come to a disco all afternoon. They'd get their pop, they'd get some food, and he was kind of the birth of kind of discos really for the younger generation. And he ran them very successfully, very well. And as a result of that, he kind of started to get a bit of a name of himself, and he was very kind of garish, outlandish. He'd wear very, loud tracksuits, have this long white hair. And he came to the attention of the BBC. And the BBC said, you know what, this guy's got something about him. And that's it. He kind of just took off, and he became this kind of radio media mogul around music, which resulted him fronting, channels on BBC Radio 1. He fronted up BBC Jim Will Fix It and a number of other high profile programs. And that got him, of course, not only a frontline audience through his channels, through his programs on the BBC, but crucially, and I said this when I did an interview for the Radio Times afterwards, I believe a lot of that was his engineering in order to gain access to his victims.
So when did Jimmy Savile first come onto your radar?
I was just coming back from Interpol, and it was on the way back. My producer, Marion Jones, said to me, "Have you ever heard anything about Jimmy Savile being a sex offender?" And I went, "No." I said, "He's a weirdo." I said, "I wouldn't let him anywhere near my kids." But no, why? He said, "Well, there's a lot online. If you know where to look, particularly around care leavers, so people who've been in care, and children's homes in particular, about him being an offender." And I went, "That's interesting." No, I hadn't. He said, "Well, apparently a police force, either Surrey or Sussex, was involved with him in some degree as far as the investigation goes. Had you ever heard about it?" And I said, "No." I said, "I'd be surprised if it's Surrey, unless it happened after I left the force, because it couldn't have happened whilst I was in the force because of the work that I was doing. I would have known about it, but that's quite interesting." And I said, I'd be really interested to be involved in it. Anyway, he said, "Well, listen, we've got one of the other presenters is doing, or reporters is doing it, but we'll keep you across it, bearing in mind of your work in terms of investigations, particularly in relation to high profile sex offenders." And that was it. And we didn't talk about it anymore, and I left it. And then some months later, he dies. I think he died, and then the following week I got a phone call from Marion who says, "Oh, we're now going to do a program. We couldn't do anything before whilst he was alive because he's such a litigious bloke. We couldn't do anything." And I went, "Okay." He said, "As I said to you before, we've got someone that's going to be the reporter, but would you give us an interview in relation to the evidence we've got? We haven't got any complainants directly, so we've got no direct victims, but we do have someone that's giving information about what they know and what they saw." There was a very interesting period of time then, because between that time and obviously some considerations from their editor, Marion came back to me and said, "We're not running it." And I went, "Okay, is there any particular reason why?" Because it's quite interesting that Surrey Police did interview him over a number of allegations, and obviously you've got some information. Why are you not going to do anything? And they said, "Well, because the editor doesn't believe that there's a story on the basis that it's not a police failure." And that's something that's always sat with me, because it's like, not a police failure. That's not the important element here. The important element is we have a high profile A-list celebrity. If you look at the status of Jimmy Savile during the height of his celebrity status, he was massive. Those days there was only BBC and ITV as far as platform goes, and he was pulling in, I don't know, 20 plus million a weekend. That's phenomenal. You wouldn't even get that now. So he was massive. And what we're saying is this man was interviewed under caution for child sex abuse, and there are other allegations about him. That's the story. It's secondary whether or not the police, what the police have done, whether they've done it correctly. Anyway, the editor couldn't see this. He was wrong, totally wrong. And I've been very outspoken about that. So they dropped it. They didn't do any more on it. And then he said to me, "Mark, what do you think about it?" And I said, it needs some more investigation. They hadn't got a victim, and their work they'd done was very much in the elementary stages. So much so that actually, I think, had Newsnight have broadcast it, it wouldn't have had the impact our programme had. And I'm not even sure it would have picked up and had the tidal wave effect that it did. So I said, let me look at it. If you're happy, can I run with it? Because I don't want to tread on your toes as a fellow journalist. He said, "Absolutely, Mark." He said, "If there's anybody that can do it, it's you." So I looked at it. We had a meeting with the lawyer at ITV and my exec producer at ITV, and they were very nervous. But they both said, "Well, listen, let's give it a run, have a look at it." So my producer, who I'd done quite a bit of work with at the time, Leslie Gardner, she came on board, and Leslie and I worked on it. ITV was so nervous that at that stage, and up until, in fact, the day of broadcast, I was paid no money. I was doing all this investigation for best part of kind of like 9-10 months, totally free. And it was only on the day of broadcast they said, "Oh, we better pay you something," which was kind of like, and that just goes to show kind of like the person I am. I'm not a rich person, but I care so much about people. Obviously, I have to make a living, so I have to charge to some degree, but I helped so many people out. And I suppose I got into that and I thought, do you know what? I can see there's something here. We set off on a path for kind of like 9-10 months, speaking to potential victims, witnesses, phoning people up, and really, really kind of chipping away at the surface to try and find what Savile had potentially done to young people. And we were building a really big picture up, regularly going back to ITV and saying, look, this is what we've got, this is what we found. And at each point, they were kind of pushing back and going, well, we need more, we need more. And we got to a point where we had 5 confirmed victims, some very powerful accounts. So we went back to them and said, look, and we'd cut a little tape together of these 5 victims, gave them to ITV, and ITV went, it's really powerful, but we might need more, we might need more. And I remember sitting down with them and saying, listen, one of the, I mean, I've got a number of rules, but one of the rules I do have is that if I'm going to interview somebody for an allegation, and particularly if they're going to, open their heart up in terms of what happens to them, and I've said to them it's for the purpose of a program, then I am going to put them on screen. And I'm not going to get someone to relay everything, and then that's abusive. And so I said, look, we've got an hour's program. 5 will fill that hour's program with everything else. We don't need any more victims, and their accounts are really powerful. So we looked at that, and we thought, well, what else can we do to bolster that aspect around it? So I got a lawyer, the late Ian Glenn. He gave us a really powerful. He was. Obviously, whilst the Queen was alive, he was a Queen's Counsel then, and he looked at the accounts and he said very clearly, there is some real consistency that exists between the account givers, but also crucially, they don't know each other. And what we set out to do with those 5 victims is really important, because a large amount of his victims had come through the care home system. And it's very easy, and I've done lots and lots of child abuse investigations, and it's very easy for the members of the public, or particularly high-profile offenders, to literally latch onto that and go, well, you're someone in care, so you can't be believed. So what we worked on is finding people from different outlets of where Savile would have access to, but also different individuals with different backgrounds. So if they were to criticise those people, the most vulnerable in society, we had other people who didn't have the unfortunateness of growing up in a vulnerable environment. And by putting those types of individuals together, giving very similar accounts, they supported each other and they gave weight and strength to the allegations. And that's essentially what we built on. We kind of came to a decision. We thought, what, we've got to get this over the line. And it was hard work. I've never opened up properly in terms of how hard work it was to get ITV to properly commission this. Hats off to them, it did. And they've lived off the commissioning of Jimmy Savile for many, many years now. But it was incredibly hard work, and perhaps one day I'll reveal how difficult it was and the things that we had to do to get it over the line. But I also got, and this was probably the most worrying thing, is I got sent an incendiary device. So I got a phone call from my exec producer boss and said, look, Mark, please don't stress about this, but we have had an incendiary device sent to you for your attention at ITV. So an incendiary device is basically a letter bomb. So a letter bomb that was analysed by the police, and basically they said, had it have gone off, it would have probably have taken your hand off and might have done more damage than that. It would have taken your hand off and probably would have seriously damaged your face, if not, it could have killed. It could have killed. But the reason it didn't go off was because whoever sent it and whoever put it together, there was a leak, and the fuel that was making it incendiary had leaked. When the post came in, there was obviously a smell to it, and the post room immediately shut everything down. They've got protocols in place, shut everything down, called the police in, and that's when they identified it as an incendiary device. Anyway, they did some work behind the back of it, and they never found out who sent it. But no doubt at all that was sent by somebody in relation to Savile. And I know that because there are other things that I've had said to me, emailed to me, I've heard via third parties of people who are very, very annoyed that I exposed Savile, very, very annoyed, not just in relation to Savile, but it's the impact that it's had on other people. So there are other people up and down the country who have been arrested. I got sent an email that was shared to me, as well as the director of television at ITV, which was saying, as a direct result of your program on Savile and the second program we did and the media fallout, you have saved in excess of 1,000 children. Anyway, we got the program in a really good shape. And then we got to a position where the press department said, look, we want to push this story out. Let's give it to one of the newspapers to push out. And he gave it to the Mail. The Mail were going to do a big story on it. And I think it was due to go to the Mail on Sunday, and he was confident it would go really, really well. And I said, okay, well, I've got a really good relationship with the Mirror and the Sunday People. Are you happy for me to give some other elements to them? He said, that's fine, as long as the Mail kind of have the exclusive. Anyway, the Mail were phoning me up on a Saturday, and I remember I was watching my son play football, and the phone was going, and it was the Mail, keep checking facts out. And it got to the end of a point where they said, you know what, it's just not big enough, really. We just don't think it's got the bits that take it over the line. And I remember thinking, okay, all right. And I said, well, that's your call. I'm just telling you what it is. Anyway, the next day, the Mail ran it on page 5 or 6, not as a big story. And the Mirror ran it on the front pages of their Sunday Mirror edition and the Sunday People edition, and it ran on the front pages, just flew off, and the story kept running for weeks. It dominated the front page, because of course it then took a life of its own. So not only did we have Jimmy Savile, but we also had the other individuals that were now being named, and the information was coming into me in relation to that. And of course, we had the uniqueness of the Director General resigning as a result of the actions and what he'd done and what the BBC had failed to do. It was massive.
How many victims were there in total?
There was a very interesting process that took place. The programme goes out, and my phone rang, and my agent said, look, the superintendent in charge of a team in the Metropolitan Police, part of the Child Abuse Command, wants an urgent meeting with you. So we arranged to meet the following day in the ITV Towers. And I remember we were there with the lawyer, exec producer, a couple of other, high management levels at ITV. And he was there with a couple of other members of his staff. And I remember him sitting there saying, look, I've been appointed by the commissioner to do a scoping exercise. I'm a detective. I don't do scoping exercise. It's an investigation for me. I'm really interested. We've done a bit of research, and we probably think there's about 30 to 35 victims. And I went, no. I said, I've been looking at this for the best part of 10, 12 months. I said, there's 500 victims, I reckon, around this. Anyway, fast forward 12 months, because what our programme did is it enabled not just the Metropolitan Police to do an investigation, but it caused the health service, it caused the prison service to do lots of internal reviews. And the outcome of it is that there was close to 500 victims. I think they settled on about 450 victims. So when I said 500, I was pretty close to being absolutely spot on, and that's how many there were. There are 3 elements to an offending behaviour: access, opportunity, and motivation. Now, motivation for me is the least important, because what motivates one person can be completely different to what motivates somebody else. But the 2 consistent elements are access and opportunity. In order to gain access to somebody, you have to, know that you're not going to be watched, you'll know that a child's there at a certain time. That's your access. And without access, you can't offend, because you need to be able to touch them, you need to be able to do something. So obviously now access has moved online, but in those days, access was about that physical contact between you. So he engineered the access. The opportunity was that he would be in a room alone with a child where nobody else was. He would be in a position where there weren't other people. And this is a man who, in his changing rooms, his dressing rooms, children would come and see him. At Top of the Pops, which was where a lot of his young girls, or a number of the young girls that he offended against, he would have contact to. They'd come into his room. And in those days, there wasn't such thing as child protection. 13, 14-year-old girls, although there was an age limit, they'd end up going to Top of the Pops. They'd be in his room. So he created some of his programs undoubtedly in order to gain access and the opportunity to offend against children. But it wasn't just through his TV work. He was also quite high profile in terms of generating his own PR, his own publicity. And we've seen that with the work that he did at Stoke Mandeville. He offended against children at Stoke Mandeville. Patients seriously ill, he would offend against. Broadmoor, he was given access to Broadmoor. Incredible. The most dangerous offenders in one of the most high profile, secure establishments, he was given a set of keys. He had free access to walk all the way around Broadmoor, where some of the most dangerous, but also some of the most vulnerable people were. There was occasions I interviewed a young girl for my Jimmy Savile second program, and this young lady had been sexually abused by Savile. But Savile, for example, in those days, they had, nowadays shower cubicles, but in those days there were baths, and the girls would be having a bath, and he would just walk around. He'd have complete access to do whatever he wanted, and enabling his offending behaviour. But also, he'd go to children's homes. So he'd go and have access, again, to vulnerable children. And that's when he would offend. So this was a man that created access and opportunity and knew exactly what he was doing. A very dangerous man with a huge, huge profile. And there'll be many people that'll be watching this that actually probably never heard of Jimmy Savile in so much as what he did. They'll now know him because of the legacy that he leaves behind in terms of his offending behaviour. But talk to your mum, talk to your dad, talk to your grandparents, ask them what they remember about Jimmy Savile, and you can almost guarantee they will have a story for you. The outcome is that we now know that Jimmy Savile was a serial sex offender, not just in relation to children, but also in relation to adults, predominantly children, and overwhelmingly females, although there were some male victims in there as well. We showed him in relation to that. The Metropolitan Police subsequently did an investigation, and Operation U-Tree, which was the knock-on operation from it, which came as a direct result of my programme. And whilst people say, oh, you didn't expose Jimmy Savile, well, the reality is yes, of course, people in the past, have said things about Savile, but none of that led to his outing. None of that led to the huge investigation that followed. The work that I've done, and my colleague, Leslie Gardner, who she was on my shoulder the whole way along. I think I pay huge respect for the work that she did with me. I led it like a police investigation. Up and down the country, people were being arrested. And I was very vocal in terms of outspeaking and saying that this is the time now. There is a complete shift in attitude. This is a time now to talk up. If you're a victim, please have the strength to come forward. And I would say to people, very openly, is that if you're an offender, I want you to sleep really restless, in the anticipation that next knock on the door may well be the police coming to arrest you. You may have sat with your crime for decades in the hope that it will go away, but you've affected someone's life, and that I want you to live with that fear. And I say that today, for anybody out there that's committed an offence against a child, I hope you do sleep restlessly. And I do hope that every time there's a knock on the door that you're fearful that it's the police finally catching up with you. I don't think in my lifetime there'll ever be a story that has such a significant impact in changing people's lives. And, I remember Tim Loughton, the children's minister at the time, specifically mentioning me and my programme in the House of Commons and saying how important it was. It was a tidal change. It really did. It changed policy for police. It changed policy for children's services. It changed policy for about everybody, really. Anybody that had any involvement with children, it changed the landscape completely for the better. And significantly, it made those people who thought they were untouchable, touchable. The likes of Max Clifford, the likes of Rolf Harris. Those two cases in particular that I was involved in, helping to bring them to justice. And you think to yourself, Jimmy Savile was big, but Rolf Harris, massive. Finally brought down. And that is the power of the media.